Good morning, everybody. We shall start our next session. This is a session number 5. Originally, I prepared my slides beforehand, so it was still that session number 2. And my name is Rico Brett. I'm the moderator of this session, and Raul Taylor is the rapporteur, so that he will write up everything we are going to say here in the morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, this problem, the network society and the complexity is really very interesting indeed. And during this last decade, probably there is attention to all kind of complexities in physics, in biology, and certainly in society. And the questions we have to address are given here now, and these are exactly as they were distributed, except the last one I added there about the sustainability, and that was exactly what Raul said yesterday, if you remember. But we didn't agree on that, so that it was my own invention just to add this last one. And this is certainly very important because it's the system could be very, very complex, the networks, but how long they will stay like that. And certainly that, just to start a couple of words, if you allow me, you probably remember that what a doctor said about 30 years ago, that we are very good, mankind is very good to dissect the big problems into the smaller ones, and the smaller ones until we are able to solve them. We are so good in it that we very often forget to put the pieces back again. And this is something that is done, all this sort of, if you look at the complexity science and all that sort of problem. And certainly, it's not only the session we are now interested in, it's also also all of these other quite interesting results. Recently, this is a book published last year by Springer, and on the results of one of the future emerging technology pilot projects in Europe. So that it was the so-called photoreactive tea. And quite interesting, very rather brief, but gives a very good understanding what happens in this complex world and in the complex society. Another one I would like to draw your attention is that the OECD has also paid a lot of attention. This forum was a couple of years ago already, but this, as you see, the application of complexity science for public policy is really something that also the OECD is very much interested in. So actually there are many examples we can go through. Science is certainly very much interconnected as a network. So that here it's one scheme from the analysis of about society, about the cooperation between the two countries in research. And again, this is not everything. It's starting from a certain threshold. Not every cooperation is included, but it shows also the strength of one or another country, and certainly all the countries are interconnected. So that's important. And certainly that if we follow with all these examples that everyone will show that one of the networks which we are using on the everyday basis is the internet, and quite probably the speakers will also touch this problem. Again, this example, which is actually not very old, this has created a lot of analysis and a lot of laws, of the power law and all that, between the servers, between the nodes, between the links, and all that has been established. And certainly, we can give very many examples. Something like that. If you look here, completely different world. It's a transfer of football players of the World Cup. And this is how, after that, they were transferred from one country to another. Well, it is, well, good or not, that's another problem, but this is how the world is organized. Now, a couple of examples more, and I shall finish them. We are in Italy. Here, this is the scheme, how the families in Florence have been related to each other through marriages. Well, that was for the 15th century, and that has created the Renaissance. So this is a very important part of it. Although they didn't know about these schemes, that's quite sure. But nevertheless, that this is something that we now are able to look back and think about that. So, ladies and gentlemen, this I would like to now to come to just end my introduction. If we deal with complex networks in technology, then it's very easy somehow to quantify the links, whatever we can measure them and to understand the strength of the links. But social systems, links are based on values. And this is characteristic to the society. And this probably will be also one of the questions for this our session also, how to model values and how the values in the society are to be taken into account. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have now the session with in the program it was 4 talks, but we have heard already Antonio Spilimoy yesterday. Yeah, and you will probably remember the last slide, the very short message of his, let's collaborate. Also something that's very important for the networks. And 3 talks then, and at the very end, I would like to give the floor also to Raoul Leyer, the rapporteur, some words about the forthcoming meeting. So, we have, as far as we have 3 talks only, I think that it's about 30-25 minutes, and we'll have about 20 minutes also for the discussion before the coffee break. So, ladies and gentlemen, the first speaker, speaking about hubs, networking, science, and industrial clusters.
Good morning. I'm pleased to share some results or some reflections and it's a work in progress. I keep what I am going to so I will try to cover how we think in economics networks, and then go quickly to some impressive examples of networks worldwide, in particular countries, and then I will focus on industrial clusters as network and how they evolve and what is the key element in the evolution, in the development. So this way I approach the social capital, and I have many questions for the research because it's still at the earlier stage. In economics, we discussed yesterday the borders. I missed the second session, continuing session, because I was interested in bioplastics and the natural resources. I hope it was very interesting, but I am teaching. I started with teaching microeconomics, and I think that this is the most logical and type of consistent part. It's not that with macroeconomics or with the other schools, but anyway, so we defined at the first pages, that economics is a discipline dealing with allocation of resources to meet the people's needs. And we know the 2 major mechanisms of coordination: market and market-based with the government. Unfortunately, if we rely only on the market, we are getting in troubles because there are market failures and we need the government to act. And I grew up in Poland, in Central European economy, and I know what are the governmental failures. So I think that we need to have a combination in the coordination, but I think that it's not enough because we have the third way of coordination, which is getting to play more and more important role, the networks, which contrary to government are not hierarchical, are flat and mostly voluntary organizations. So I will focus on one of these networks we call industrial clusters, which are located to certain locations. Before I will go to, I want to share just briefly, go through one of my last research on alternative climate change policy. I was thinking, what to do if the governments cannot reach consensus and move for the obligatory treaty to deal with the climate change. So I started looking at the local government initiatives because they feel the pressure. There are people dying of heat. There are facing flooding and forest fires and so on. These are the front line government focusing the consequences of climate change. So I discovered that they are organizing themselves to respond, and they are organizing themselves in the networks. One of such networks, ICLEI, so this is International Agency of Local Environmental Initiatives, which was established by 35 Canadian and American municipal governments over 20 years ago. Now it's over 1,200 members, global organization. Over 600 in the United States. So they changed the name to Local Governments for Sustainability in 2003. And there are very important layers. If you look at the meetings of conference of the parties, this climate change, there are present and there are making certain obligations. So there are, this organization, this network of local government reached 71 countries, and of course the strongest is the American chapter. So if you are, for good reasons, very critical about the U.S. government, so we should take into account that local governments are not waiting for the federal government to act, and there are working already. And I am proud to be from Seattle. Last 6 years, we had Mayor Greg Nichols, who was so disappointed that the United States didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol. So when 143 countries ratified, he made an appeal, to other colleagues, mayors, to meet and beat Kyoto Protocol. So he wanted to have 143 cities committed to Kyoto targets. And you know that he got by June, when the treaty entered in power, I guess 2005, I guess. There were over 400 cities. And now there are 1,300 cities committed to Kyoto targets. So this is really a power of networking, and also power of leadership, which is, and social capital, the trust to those guys who had the responsibilities and they knew how to reach those goals. So anyway, they have very structured programs and criteria. This is not just declaring. You have to follow procedures. I am showing the list of the 5 milestones. You advance, you are growing in the network. And then what was interesting, for me to learn that if without any government, these organizations cut almost 1/3 of the target of the pollutions of greenhouse gases, which the United States was obliged to do according to Kyoto Protocol. So this is very powerful organization. So no market, no government, but the network. It's another also network organization for C40, the largest metropolis. Now, established by initiated by mayor from London, now run by Mayor Bloomberg. So it's a powerful organization which is investing billions of dollars. The Clinton Foundation gave them $5 billion to implement a program at the big metropolis. So it's again metro. We have also regional initiatives. This is the regional climate change initiatives, Northeast, Midwest, and Western climate initiatives. And the initiatives look so promising. The Canadians joined us. And then Mexico sent also observers. So, this is the regional network is spreading out. And you see, these are the regions, the countries with the regions involved in climate change policy. So these are examples of the powerful networks, which are changing. There are not market, not government, but the network. So coming back to the economic cluster, to the industrial cluster. So we define them as geographic concentration of interconnected companies. Specializing in suppliers, service providers, different places in the supply chain, related and associated. But it's more than supply chain, because there are also academic institutions providing research, training, and consulting. There are also governmental agencies, related to economic development. There are also non-governmental organizations like professional associations, organizations of engineers and lawyers and so on. So the clusters are very important because they produce certain externalities, they produce certain benefits, because first of all they boost the innovation, because they somehow promote the active learning, facilitated by ease of making site visit, face-to-face relations. They build also this trust, by these close relations. And then they act also like conduits through the tacit information is transferred. Tacit information, you see, is very critical. And then the clusters cut the risk because the employee allocation, also the cutting the risk because of the peer pressure. You cannot screw up in your community, something, because it will stay with you forever. So you need to behave if you are part of the community. So this is very strong psychological factor. So they are also promoting and supporting the economic development. If you look the interconnectivity, the countries, the most advanced, the most competitive countries, like Nordic countries, they base the development on the cluster policy. The regions, that are interconnected. So we checked, our state is third the most innovative. State Washington, third Massachusetts and California, and we have over 10 years old strategy based on industrial clusters. We think that is very important. We did research with my Polish team in Poland. We learned that the most prospering regions are those which have the largest number of clusters. So the Mazovia region, 16 of them. And then we made a correlation, and you see the number of, GDP is not perfect measurement, but at least we have it. It's a very strong correlation between the number of clusters and the wealth measured by GDP per capita. Anyway, one of my collaborators, Derek Andreoli, who made his PhD in geography and interested also from the geographical point of view, he made a type of interesting classification of clusters. From functional clusters, which are just location together with some connections or without the clumps. It means that there are some groups in the certain location which works. And the working cluster, so when in the location, all units are working together for the benefit. They collaborate, they build that type of synergy which enhance the competitiveness. So this is the diagram, when we have the cluster initiative to move from functional cluster, just from the geographical proximity, to working cluster, to be highly integrated and to produce maximum benefits. And then this is the spatial, on the left side you see the functional cluster and some clumps, some of the firms are working, and this is the goal, want to have everybody working together. So the movement from functional to working cluster is related strongly to social capital. Because social capital encourages cooperation and build this synergy, and which creates positive externalities, I was told, and helps spill over technologies, know-how, and so on. And this way boost innovation. So, what is the social capital? So, I am not going to talk much about the academic discussion, but there are two approaches. Social capital is the private goods, from Bourdieu wrote this 86 through American psychologist, philosopher Coleman. And there is a different approach, starting with Fukuyama, as a public good. He defines, and I am closer to this definition, but I want to focus more on social capital as a public good or collective good. The set of informal rules and ethical values common for the social groups that enable them to act effectively. Another representative of this school of is American Professor Putnam, who also published significant books. So there are some attempts to combine these two approaches, and other one, they treat social capital as goodwill available to individuals or groups Its source lies in the structure and content of actor-social relations, and it affects flows from the information, influence, and solidarity it makes available to the actor. These are the academic definitions we might discuss hours, but this category already exists in the practice. As you see, this is World Bank did this and invested serious research in serious resources in research and many publications or OECD, and they defined OECD defined social capital as networks together with shared norms, values, and understanding that facilitate cooperation within or among groups. And similar definition present the World Bank institutions, relations, attitudes, and values that govern interactions among people and contributes to economic and social development. So they see the value. This is the type of capital which we missed yesterday. We're talking about human, natural, and produced capital, but social capital makes all these three types capital work. It's hard to perform without social capital. So I will. There are many definitions on social capital. My colleagues Phil Cook and Stu Rosenfeld. What is critical that through building social capital we improve efficiency, we build the most important element of any organization and any community, trust, mutual trust. If you have a trust, it facilitates exchange of information, exchange of ideas, and improve performance. So the Cook indicates that the more advanced country or region, the social capital is less social, more professional. So you think about this. But again, high trust relationships are more for business important. This is not surprise that when we check the number of clusters, and I am part of the Competitiveness Institute, they have annual conferences, and the number of clusters in developing countries is very small because there's poor trust, poor communication. And then we see the new movement for instance, in the transforming economies, those emerging economies toward clusters, but they are still far away. I mentioned Poland, one of these emerging economies performing pretty well, but we see very clearly, those regions which are investing in cluster building, which are open for the dialogue between government and business. Even they started with very poor, low level of income. I have in mind one of the poorest, I guess it was 15 or 18 poorest region in the European Union, for Carpathia region. But because of the good conditions that exist there between, good relations between government, business, universities, and professional organizations, several very sophisticated clusters appear. Among them is aerospace cluster, which is the largest in Central Eastern Europe. And the region is growing very fast. Anyway, so this is the way. I think that the clustering it means, it should help to overcome the backwardness and development, and then will help to improve, to move the regions, the nations toward prosperity. I mentioned sometimes I want one more thing, in terms of how important are the social capital and the clusters for knowledge transfer. This is somehow the task. Sticky knowledge is impossible to transfer over live, even if you have the most. It has to be face to face in the region. So anyway, I think that this is still research to progress, because I would like to know how to improve performance of clusters, how to encourage the communication, how to measure the value of the social capital, how to invest it. And I think that such forum like our academy is a good one to exchange ideas and got inspiration. Thank you for your.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's a very clear presentation about the importance of clusters, also taking into account the work between cities and people in industrial ways. And please remember the couple of keywords from the talk, the hierarchies, which are very important for network. And certainly what was mentioned a couple of times and stressed by Stephen is that they work on the set of informal rules. There are shared values, ethical values, and there is a trust that that could be effective. So, ladies and gentlemen, now it's a second speaker, Peter Johnston, and networks, growth and equity, and so on.
Well, good morning. I'm going to go through a lot of material rather quickly. My apologies to those for whom I rather oversimplify the science. My apologies to those who find it all rather basic. But I'm going to have to start by the science of networks, because I think we have to first understand what sort of network we're talking about. I think we all know that we live in networks, social networks, trade networks, community networks. But all networks aren't the same. And we're familiar with some. We're familiar with crystal lattices, we know those. We're familiar with hierarchical networks. They emerge in nature, trees. We impose them on our organizations as organograms. So we're familiar with these sorts of networks. The networks that are important to us in this debate are the third category, which are called scale-free power law small world networks. And that sounds a pretty complex name for what look like very complex networks. Fortunately, they have some remarkably simple characteristics, and they are extremely pervasive in nature, as well as in society. I mean, they have characteristics that give this particular relationship between the nodes, the blobs, and the links between them. This is a power law, which means that it's a function of the number of parameters to a particular power, and that power can be 1.5, 2, 3.5, whatever you want. Depends on the way you construct the network. They're small world in the sense that there's a remarkably small distance, number of links between any two nodes in these networks. And one of the most remarkable features is that our social networks in the world are sufficiently small world that we are probably only about 6 links from virtually anybody else. And this is not intuitive. In fact, it seems to us quite incredible, and yet we can show that this is true. We've known about these networks for quite some time, but it was only really around the year or in the late 1990s that we started to be able to measure them in a more than anecdotal way. We knew previously Hollywood actors because they were well documented in the credits of films. The company directors in the Fortune 500 list were well documented, so we knew these were small world networks. But from the emergence of the internet, we could see that our whole society was a small world network, our economy is a small world network, our organisations are small world networks, our trade links and our research networks. And at the time I was particularly interested in the research networks, and we could see that these are networks that emerge spontaneously. They are so-called self-organising networks. You don't need to structure them in an external way. This is the way they naturally emerge. People prefer to make friends with sociable people. That's the way we generate our social networks. A very simple rule of preferential attachment to the more sociable amongst us generates the scale-free structure. The intensity of linkage is important, so the more links you have, the smaller the distance between us all, and a few long links make an enormous difference to tie the whole system together. I mentioned that we tried to impose hierarchical networks on our organisations, and we failed at this because this is what organisations actually look like. They don't look like hierarchies at all. They look like small world social networks. And of course my interest at the time was to look at the European research community to see to what degree we could make this a small world network, which we substantially did in the 1990s through the European research programmes. These are the hub organisations that tie together the European research community. They tie together effectively something like 7,000 to 10,000 either businesses or universities into now a single network, and the longest distance between any two of those research organisations is 4 links, 4 collaborative links. So even if I said a small university like Joseph Institute, and I chose it because the mathematics department in Joseph Stephen Institute that produced the tool for analysis, so my thanks to them. But it's a relatively small university. It has some 200 collaborations across Europe, but it's no more than 4 links away from every other research organisation in Europe, including the private sector, the big players, as well as the other smaller universities. So these are the sorts of networks that we how does this relate to the bigger picture and particularly to sustainable development at the world level? I leave you with these observations that we need growth. We can't now simply say we have reached our limits, we must not grow anymore. We need growth. But it must be more equitable. So how can we tackle these issues of looking at how to regenerate growth in a more equitable way, making use of the social network analysis and the science of networks? There's a trick to this. We have about 7 billion people in the world, and to a degree, yes, we're the nodes and we link. We create businesses, and businesses trade with each other so that they link. Even with the computers that we have, we cannot simulate a network of 7 billion people. We cannot even simulate a network of all the businesses in the world. But there's a trick. When we were looking at our European research community, one of the peculiarities of these power law networks, these cell-free networks, is that you can do a mathematical trick. You can invert the networks. That means that instead of having the nodes as UI, myself and other people as the nodes, or research institutes as the nodes, I can change the network round, and I can say, well, let's have research topics as the nodes that are linked by the institutions that work on them. And I can then reconstruct a network that is a network of research topics linked by institutions. And lo and behold, yes, this still preserves characteristics of a power law, scale-free, small world network. So you can do another trick. You can say, well, look, our social and economic system in the world, we can parameterize this. We can identify about 200 different parameters that have been measured over the last 40 years that characterize society and its change. Some are choices, yesterday, political choices, so the amount of investment in education, the amount of investment in healthcare. Some are the consequences, the outputs, their GDP, their levels of poverty, life expectancy. And for each country in the world, you can more or less collect a pretty good set of most of these 200 odd parameters for most of the last 40 years. And these parameters you can then use in the second inversion. And instead of having a network of 7 billion people interacting, you can have a network of roughly 40,000 parameters interacting. And you don't even have to choose particularly carefully. It doesn't matter if some are redundant. When we were looking at the research networks, of course we had our pre-imposed research themes that we could choose, but we didn't have to. I could let the computer just pick out keywords from the research project abstracts and select whatever keywords it wanted, and I would still get a small world network. So it doesn't matter in this inversion, which is a purely mathematical trick, that you have what as a physicist I would call an orthogonal set of coordinates. You're not looking for this, you're simply looking for the best set of parameters that characterize society and its development. You need to look back at the correlation between them, the historic correlations, not looking for causality, simply correlation. And you use the correlations then to set up a simulation model, which you can then step forward into the future. Now, this is a radically different way of looking at economic and social development. It's not extrapolating current trends, but it is extrapolating the correlations between these parameters. So it's not going to tell us necessarily the truth about the future. It's going to give us a different view about how the future might evolve. And it's not necessarily going to tell us what happens if we get radical change, if the way that we behave changes, or if the way the Earth behaves changes, and I'll come to this. So let me then quickly move on. What do these models tell us? These so-called agent-based models. This is from the International Future System. It tells us that these world social and economic system is remarkably resilient to change. It's like a jelly. If you try and change it, it sort of wobbles a bit and jumps back. it's not necessarily totally stable. There are instabilities into the system. I said something about the instabilities in the paper, but let me not sidetrack onto that now. In general, the world system is remarkably resilient, which is good in the sense that we're relatively resilient to unforeseen shocks, but we're also rather resilient to policy intervention. So if you want to do something to stimulate growth, you might think, well, let's put more money into research and development. But if that's all you do, it's not going to have much effect. Or let's invest more in high-speed networks. Let's invest more in education, trade liberalisation, faster innovation. Any of these things alone doesn't get you much return. It's only when you put the package together that you manage to constrain this rather resilient jelly to track. So what this tells us is that a lot of our more simplistic sort of policy analysis tools that we've had for some years that go under the names of impact assessment or cost-benefit analysis, they're pretty useless for this sort of a network. You need to have a much more richer policy portfolio analysis to see how you can change the trajectory of the world. The same on equity, that because our social networks and our economic networks have this power law structure, which is a characteristic of the networks, we're never going to remove this. We're always going to have a power law distribution of wealth. Pareto's law held in the 19th century will hold in the 21st century. The power law itself will change, and we have changed it in the last 20 years in two ways. We have globalization has broadened the scale, it's widened the scale and the spectrum of wealth. So you can get rich people without affecting the poor, simply because the scale of the world economy is larger than the scale of a regional economy. If you were in a small town, the richest person in that small town as an isolated economy wouldn't be very rich on the national scale. When you integrate the national economy, you get the richer elite. When you integrate the world economy, the world richest elite is even richer. So this changes perception of inequity in society, because these very rich people from the world economic activity live in particular countries. So they tend to artificially change the perception of wealth distribution within countries. The internet as well has changed the power of distribution, because it's made that we have more links, longer links, and a faster ability to create and drop things. So the internet has changed the power or distribution of wealth in the world. That's why we do have concern about a growing inequality in the world, an inequality that seems to be impervious to policy change. But it's partly impervious because, again, there's no silver bullet. You're going to have to pull on many levers at the same time to make any significant change in the levels of inequity in world wealth. Let me then move quickly to the last issue. The big issue on the table is the issue of climate change. How can we look at the issue of the challenges of climate change with this sort of understanding of the world's economic and social system? And the challenge is remarkably urgent. This is from last year's OECD assessment to 2050. So it's an assessment of climate change, not by a group of interested scientists, by one of the most respected economic organizations in the world, it shows that we will actually, on the current trends, reach a level of 450 parts per million of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by the middle of the 2020s. It's not much more than a decade away. And beyond that, quite frankly, we don't know what will happen, because this is the level beyond which we will almost certainly get what is called dangerous climate change. But dangerous climate change in the IPCC generating more than 2 degrees average temperature rise. Now, here lies the problem for trying to integrate climate change into these models. The parameterization is wrong. 2 degrees change is not in itself a threat. If we all only had 2 degrees change in average temperature, quite frankly, we would probably welcome it. If all that happens is that we get 50 or 60 centimetres rise in ocean levels, we can live with it. It's not worth investing to avoid those risks. So we need to reparameterize climate change in terms of the social and economic risks that it presents to us, because only then can we factor it back into this complex network of social and economic activity as well. And there is a useful first step. This was from Jim Hansen in the summer last year. If you just look at the first slide, these are the distributions of weather, land summer temperature anomalies. Looking in the first graph here, as he uses a base case of the period from 1951 to 1980, and then moving up decade by decade. So moving up, and then the last one is the decade from 2001 to 2011. Of course, you see gradual warming. The peak of the distribution moves up. So as you can see there, the peak of the distribution moves about a degree higher than it was in the last 30 years. But the important thing is not that the peak has moved. The important thing is that the 3 sigma extreme weather events that used to be extremely rare, 1.5%, so the 100-year flood, or the 100-year drought, or the 100-year hurricane, or the 100-year storm. This used to be a very rare event, and it's no longer a very rare event. It's now about a once in 10 years event. And the extremes, you can go out to 5 sigma now, at about 1%. So we've substantially changed the patterns of extreme weather events. And of course, this then you can relate to the rapidly increasing insurance losses from extreme weather, the rapidly increasing numbers of people displaced by droughts and floods. So you now begin to be able to reparameterize climate change as a real threat to our social and economic system. So the next stage then is to do that, and is to actually then be able to come back, I hope, between 2014 and 2015, with a real risk assessment. That is a risk assessment that actually tells us how far we can go before this costs us too much. And one thing is already clear is that we're not going to stay on the 2-degree trajectory. These graphs are of historic importance only these days, because we're somewhere up here. So there's no way that we're going to solve the climate change challenge simply by reducing the emissions from fossil fuels. We're not on the track. Nowhere near it. Do something. talking about the networks. Networks are the most effective way that you change networks. And the most effective network we have in the world is trade. So the first thing, and the thing that makes the most impact, would be a robust carbon trading system. And that means carbon trading that is based on carbon accounting, measuring carbon emissions at the point of emission, reporting carbon emissions in quarterly reports or annual reports from companies, tracking carbon emissions through the supply chain, labelling all the products and services that we buy with their carbon emission load, and then allowing us to trade emissions against sequestration. We're going to have to manage the climate, not just reduce emissions. So we're going to have to learn within the next 20 or 30 years how to actually stabilize the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then manage it to give us a stable climate for the future. And it probably can be done. We also need to shift our electrical power system to a much more pervasive grid that is more responsive to demand, real-time pricing. Let's move the transport system onto the electrical power system. It's nonsense to pipe gas to homes and businesses. It would, as a physicist, it would be twice as efficient to burn the gas in the power station, generate electrical power, and use the electrical power to run heat pumps for space heating. This would save you half your power consumption. So let's get on to an electrical grid powered economy, and let's broaden out this connectivity, social connectivity around the world, so that all these innovations in lifestyle spread through more quickly. It's happening, and it's being driven by the private sector, in this case by the insurance and pension fund investment community. We need carbon transparency for consumers. And if we do that, if we do these three things, so this is again back to international futures, if you even put only a $17 or 17 euros a tonne price on carbon, and you put in these network solutions, you can make a substantial difference to the carbon emissions trajectory. You can get this to peak already in the 2020s and then come down afterwards. And you can start to stabilise greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But it's entirely doable. Admittedly, this solution is still only going to stabilise at about 500 parts per million. It may be too high, and maybe we have to do more then on the drawdown of carbon rather than just removing or reducing emissions. So I leave you on that positive note that I think network analysis does give you a new insight into how you can engineer the future. And it's a very positive insight that if you package your measures appropriately, then we can have an impact on our future trajectory that puts us back on track for a more equitable and a more prosperous and a rather safer future than we are at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very clear presentation about the ideas of the networks and then the ideas about the implementation. So that's while I marked here 2 points. First is why elections are needed, which is very important. And next, how we could implement this knowledge around networks to meet these challenges, like their work about the climate change and the carbon emission and all that. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we come to the last talk of the session. It's Walter Zimmerlin, how we should think and act in networks. So, Walter, the floor is yours, and I shall just continue.
Thank you so much. It's not the first talk in my life, but the first talk as a fellow of this academy. So thank you so much, and I'm still very proud, especially because of the button. The lady who served me coffee today asked me what a beautiful button this was. Usually 20 years ago, the ladies would have asked what the last guy was. Well, I want to talk about different things which have been touched already. I'm especially grateful to Peter for his last remarks for two reasons. One reason being I am the president of a newly founded university. It was founded 21 years ago. It's in the midst of the largest lignite area in Germany. And we do deal with these issues on a daily basis, and I would think that carbon dioxide emission would be just one of the problems. Another problem, you touched that, was part of the solution, that is smart grids. But that's only one aspect. The other aspect I mentioned yesterday, storage. Because if you want to shift to renewables, you have to somehow store the energy. Otherwise, you will never succeed. So thank you so much for that. I have a second reason, because, academia lives of dispute and discussion, and I think you're quite wrong as far as the solution is concerned. You can't probably solve it by raising the price. We tried that with the crude oil. It didn't work, and it won't work with carbon dioxide either, I guess. So this is just for opening the discussion for afterwards. I'm planning, first of all, I have to tell you what this is. This is part of our library. It's probably the most beautiful library in the world. It's been built by Herzog de Meuron, with the two architects who did also the bird's nest in Beijing. This big stadium, and it was the only library they ever built, because we said, don't build libraries, don't build something else, build a node in the knowledge network. That's what they did. That's why we don't call it a library. It's our information, communication, and networking center. Because if you go into this beautiful building, they also call it the Castel del Monte of knowledge. If you go into this beautiful building, of course you will find books, but you will find, of course, lots and lots of computer screens, because that's the way knowledge is being transferred these days. It's nice to have books because it looks beautiful at the shelves, and the insulation effect is much better than on computers. But that's about all. I love books, but I think these days we have to deal with other information media, and that's what I'll be talking about. Well, I would like to, after having finished the preliminary remarks, which will probably be the case in about half an hour, I will talk about from chain to net. Then I would like to talk about the development from artificial intelligence to swarm intelligence. Then I would like to talk about the difference between virtually real and really virtual. And the fourth step, I would like to focus on the question of the individual, the traditional or non-traditional identity, and in the end, I will talk about Homo sapiens, the role of the human being as a thinking being revisited, and that then will lead to conclusion. Okay, let's start with two stories. Well, it's not stories, two personal remarks. My whole talk will be about the topic old habits die hard. Old habits die hard. Look at this place here. This is a traditional learning space, right? But it contradicts almost everything we have discussed so far. An individual is talking to 50 other individuals. No network at all. Just the idea of transferring knowledge, which, as we all know, doesn't work. At most 40% of what I'm saying will be in your memory afterwards. So be very careful picking the right things. Think of examinations. We still think that we have to, but put it differently. Think you advertise for a position of a CEO, and you're asking for a person who doesn't communicate with other people, who does not use any means like internet or books, who is completely autistic. Well, we do have a lot of CEOs like that, I know, but you wouldn't advertise it. But in the testing of the abilities of our students, we test exactly like this. We are testing whether an individual knows something which he has stored in the little space between his or her 2 ears. We let them write something. We even let them tell you that they haven't used anything else. They even have to swear for that. Completely idiotic. It's medieval. It's testing medieval abilities in order to test for the future. Because old habits die hard. And if you just for a minute ask yourselves whether you think somebody who is cheating in the classroom is better or worse than somebody who is not cheating, then you suddenly find out cheating is the virtue of the future. It's interacting with others. It's asking of it. It's looking for the expertise. It's network. So we are supposed to maybe change our habits of testing the abilities of our individual students. And let me tell another story. Well, that was not a story, that was just the truth. Let me tell you a story. When I was a young professor, I wrote an article on a book written by the then famous Niklas Luhmann, system theoretician, self-organization theoretician, and he did a huge book on justice and the system of legal system. And I wrote a short article of that book, saying, well, the only thing I'm missing in this book, which is gorgeous, is the individual. He's talking about systems all the time, and he's not talking about individuals. So I got this beautiful letter, which I read, saying, dear young colleague, how do you know that individuals exist? Question mark. Yours, Niklas Luhmann. Well, this, since then, that was in the 80s, since then there's the question I'm looking for. How do I know that individuals exist? And how do I reintroduce individuals into system theory? Because I don't know that individuals exist, but I believe that they exist, and I think they better do. Okay, so these are my 2 stories, and this is the topic of my talk. Old habits die hard. We still think in notions of chain. You know, there's been this famous book by Lovejoy called The Great Chain of Being, and he was looking at the last 300 centuries. And he saw that in the 300 centuries, all scientific, academic, and philosophical modeling of the world was going according to the meta-paradigm of chain, causality, linear things, cause and effects, whatever. So it was always the chain metaphor. I was talking about metaphors yesterday, and metaphors are probably the most powerful linguistic tool we have. So it's always the great chain, evolution, great chain. But if you have a closer look, it's not a chain at all. Or at least it's a chain with a lot of missing links. So it's not a chain. And if you have a little closer look, then you see that, of course, it's always been networks. It's always been interrelated chains. It's always been crossroads chains. But this meta-paradigm is not just a paradigm. It's not just within one group of disciplines. It's permeating through all scientific, to all life world endeavors, in all social theory, in social practice. We always have this idea of chain. Everybody thinks in chains. Everybody, including all of you. And including me, of course. So how do we solve that problem? Well, we probably have to deliberately try to not think can change anymore. And for this, something helps. We were discussing, if you remember, the day before yesterday, we were discussing pre-Socratic philosophy. We were discussing the notion of war, war being the father of all things. And we said, well, we have a literal translation to that and another, and probably the other one's better. But still, the literal one helps. If we look, for instance, at the emergence of the net, of the World Wide Web, we then see that the World Wide Web existed since the late 60s. It was the Pentagon network, the ARPANET. We didn't know about it. It was secret, of course. It's Pentagon, so it was secret. But we could have known, because if we look now from the history of ideas perspective at the learned literature of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, we suddenly see emerging a paradigm, again permeating all disciplines, a paradigm starting from semantics, semantic theory of memory was the first starting point, and from that point on, there was in the early 60s, in artificial intelligence discussions, in the debates on representation of knowledge, in debates of self-organization, suddenly the notion of networks pops up off the ground in all different disciplines, in all aspects of the life world. And how come that although we knew that everything was a network, we still were not convinced that this would be the way to go? Well, the answer is because we didn't have a real-life example. You were touching them. And in the very moment the Internet started to become a civil network, connecting all people, almost all people. We discussed about the different geographic distributions of access to Internet yesterday. But still, possibly integrating or interrelating all people on this globe. Since that point in time, we suddenly started to believe in networks. So, what is now the characteristic of networks? We have discussed that. I would like to focus on just one aspect, which will be important for what I have to say afterwards. A network is a system without a center. It's a decentralized system. Each node can be the center. So decentralized systems are modeled according to networks. We have discussed different types of networks, and that's very important to distinguish these different types of networks, but they all have the characteristic that they don't have a middle of a center. And now if you look at French philosophy, for instance, you would suddenly find that in French philosophy, without talking about technology at all, in French philosophy, the decentralization becomes the main topic of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So to talk about us, about human beings, as not being the centers of the world, like Kant still thought, but being, some peripheral, but still some nodes in the network. That becomes the new challenge after the 90s. In the 90s, that's only 20 years ago. In the 90s, the World Wide Web started. There were some web pioneers. Beautiful books by Howard Rheingold, if you would have a look at the history of the World Wide Web. If you want to remind yourselves of those days when we didn't have that access, then read these books, and crime stories. It's fascinating to read how some individuals who decided to connect their personal computers to the phone net, how some individuals created the civil World Wide Web, whereas the Pentagon network, the ARPANET, still existed, of course, and had the same purpose, i.e. to decentralize the defense system in order to reduce the possibility for the enemy, the Russians then, or Soviet Union rather, to wipe out the defense system of the US, so they decentralized the knowledge system, the brain cells. Decentralization gives optimal security and flexibility. That was the issue of the ARPANET already, but now it's also the issue of the World Wide Web. So we have no central point of control. Every central link is able to take over the function of all the others. And that's almost like our brain. I mean, we do have some little scientists amongst us who can tell us a little bit about which parts of the brain are capable of taking over the function of the other. Not every part is capable, but it's extremely plastic, our brain. So the net tries to somehow simulate the brain. So the basic idea of the net is something like the hardware system of our mind, our individuality. I'll come back. Okay. Parallel to this, we have a development starting in the 50s, development of artificial intelligence. First, as you all know, triggered by Alan Turing and his famous small article on the questions whether machines can think. From then on, we have half a century of intensive discussion on the question whether they are things like thinking machines. But that's not all. We finally realized that even if machines could think, which in actual fact doesn't matter at all, except for the question I will be finishing here. The most important thing about artificial intelligence is the possibility to externally store knowledge. And that was done with books already. But on a much smaller scale, of course. The externalization of knowledge that's the secret of artificial intelligence. So when we combine artificial intelligence research, which now is a part of informatics, it's nothing special anymore. If we combine that with the World Wide Web, we suddenly realize that artificial intelligence issue has become the issue of distributed artificial intelligence. Because, of course, 500,000 units are more flexible and capable of storing knowledge than just one personal computer. So the word network then has led to the idea that there could be something like a network, a social network, a network society. There was, at the change of the century, you all know the 3-volume work of Manuel Castells. First of all, tried to summarize that and coined the idea of the network society. From that time on, we knew that human beings have become network human beings. They were before, of course, but then we realized that they are network human beings. And now the most recent development is now that we start to rethink our notion of distributed artificial intelligence by looking at what animals do, especially ants. And we suddenly find out that there is a trans-individual type of intelligence, which we call swarm intelligence. And the fascinating thing now is that we can produce little robots, nanobots, they're called small nanobots, who behave intelligently like a swarm of birds or a swarm of ants. And we can program that. And now the internet has become the medium of swarm intelligence and of swarm robot intelligence. And that's fascinating because suddenly we realize that intelligence is not something which can be stored between 2 years only. Maybe we'll come back to that in the discussion. A third parallel development was the development of what we call virtual reality. We all know that especially young people use the internet as some kind of second reality. They play games, but these are reality games. And these reality games attach new types of identities. So they take on second or third identities. Second life, it's not a theological notion anymore, it's a notion of behaving on the net or internet. And this kind of really virtual or virtual real is something which a lot of people, especially parents, are afraid of. They say, well, our children, they play all the time, and they miss the real sense of the world, the purpose of living, because they live in a fake world. I suddenly recalled that my father said I shouldn't read too much novels, because if I read novels, I'm living in a fake world. And then I remember, at least myself, telling my children that they shouldn't watch too much TV, because TV, is a different type of reality, and then suddenly they mistake the TV reality for the real life reality. And now we find out that the generation of my grandchildren are having the same problem. Or is it rather that we have the same problem? If we read Plato, we suddenly find out that he had the same problem, that he thought that the youth was useless, and they didn't know anything, and they did mistake reality for, something else. So maybe it's a pattern, transgenerational behavior pattern. It's an old habit which dies hard. Now the interesting question is whether there still is a border between the self, which we call me, and the outside world, or whether by surfing on the net in a different identity or different identities, we suddenly miss the border between the me and the outside world. And we know from psychology that if this border isn't there anymore, we're suffering from serious mental disease. So maybe this is a kind of let's call it a worldwide mental disease, surfing on the net. But the answer is no, that's not the case, because if you analyze it, then you see that human beings, whatever the games they play, soccer, or play games on the stage, or play games in the movie, or play games chessboard. They always have two roles: the self and the role as a role player that play. And that applies also to the internet, of course. And therefore, the fourth step, the fourth question is, how do the individuals develop their identity if they are network individuals? Become people dependent on the network? Do they become maybe even vulnerable to some kind of blackmail? They are completely dependent. We all are completely dependent on the internet. We wouldn't be here if the internet would work, because no plane would fly, no train would come, no car would be efficiently at least finding where it's supposed to go. So the question is, do we use the net, or does the net use us? If you are nodes in the net, we are nodes in the net. Then the question is, does the net itself manage to do what it wants if it wants something with us, or are we still the bosses in our own houses, to use a metaphor by Freud? Now, will the modern human being get lost in the virtual world? The answer was no, because it's wrong to think that in the net we have virtual identity. It's correct to think of in the net we are classical. We do have classical identities, personal identities, as player in the game, in the net. But we increase the means of action by virtuality. That's the possibility we have on the net. And that's the basic of a successful thinking and acting in networks, that we still believe that there is the individual human being, and it's not being lost in the deserts of the vast deserts of the internet. And that's now the question, if that's the case, what definition of human being and his or her identity is then important? Now, we know that the knowledge of the network human being will change. I have tried to illustrate this at the very beginning with our examination procedures. That will definitely change. Why? Well, because we are in a knowledge society, but that doesn't mean that we know more than our parents or grandparents did, in the sense of having more between our 2 ears. But it implies that we are capable of having access to much more knowledge than our teachers and parents and grandparents did. If I recall, for instance, one of my academic teachers, we were talking about him yesterday, Hans Gardner, he of course knew much more than I ever will know. And my students hopefully think that I know much more than they ever will know. But if I compare my students to my teacher, then I know he would be lost in the network society because he doesn't know how to handle the access to the knowledge. So that's an interesting definition. Now, if we look at definitions of learned people, then we see long before the internet area definition, the person is a learned person if he or she is capable to find what he or she doesn't know. So not to know is the definition of being a learned person, but to know where to find what you don't know. That always was the definition. It was the Oxford Dictionary, whatever. Now it's the internet. But it still is I call it knowledge technology. It's the capability of surfing the net in order to get the knowledge you want to know. And that suddenly reminds us that from the very beginning of our history, of our written history, we always knew that to know means to know that we don't know. Yesterday we talked about uncertainty. So today I would rather like to talk about ignorance. Ignorance becomes the most important aspect about it. If you think of the portion of your life you manage because of explicit knowledge, then you find out it's a preliminary. The rest you manage without explicit knowledge. The rest you manage although, or maybe because you don't know. We don't know how to live. How do we manage? If we live in a knowledge society, then we probably die. Because we don't know how to manage the weather. Well, the answer is easy. The answer is the written answer. If you don't know how the weather will be, take an umbrella. But that's managing of ignorance. And our whole life is, in actual fact, kind of a definition of Homo sapiens ignorance. We are Homo sapiens because we know that we don't know. But most people don't know that they don't know. So in the knowledge society, Homo sapiens knows that there are different types of ignorance, that you can deal with ignorance, that you can manage ignorance. So you have a second order knowledge about what you don't definitely know. Even statistical knowledge was a way of managing the fact that you didn't know the location and the impulse of an electron. Because you knew that you could never know, you tried to deal with it statistically. And the same thing applies, of course, to most levels of our knowledge in which we apply statistics. So Homo sapiens becomes, in the knowledge society, the Homo sapiens doctor of ignorance. Now there are some questions which are still open. Is the net at the end of privacy? I do have one of those ugly features here, and it keeps bothering me all the time, and it keeps bothering you, and you do not have any privacy, and we are always and everywhere available. You are being ever more transparent. The very moment you use your credit card, some people will know where you are, what you're buying. So we have to protect our individual data. And services such like Facebook and Twitter have changed the idea of privacy completely. Next generation is doing incredible things on Facebook. We were talking about that last night, or before last night also. But there is still, this is a wonderful quotation which I love, but I still don't know who said it first. So instead of pretending that it's my own quotation, I just put it in quotation marks saying, that computers, and we can replace this now by networks are becoming more and more similar to the human beings. Sooner or later, they will be able to do everything except thinking. And that's probably also true for us. But still, thinking could be the only thing left which makes us human beings unique, and that's probably one of the reasons why we have the catechists. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Walter, for explaining about the situation of a human being in this complicated world and the networks and all that. So that now we have still a couple of, 10 minutes at least for discussion, or we can...
Yes. A couple of points on social capital. I think it was very important to recognize that negative social capital is important than positive social capital. The most enduring forms of social capital are the mafia, the drug cartels, the gangs. They have very strong social capital, but most of us can see as negative results. Putnam, when he studied Italy, made the point that social capital is important for resilience. And again, I think we have to be much less starry-eyed about the concept of resilience. It's negative and positive. The bankers in London are probably going to become the most resilient social network in the next 10 years. And they're going to be resilient to change. And so I think we've sort of gotten caught in the resilience game of believing it's all positive. And we have to take less than a starry-eyed view of it. My final comment is just on Peter. The issue, as I understand Peter, is that you're making the case for carbon prices, not energy prices, which is correct. Rising energy prices have had the unintended consequences of locking us into fossil fuels. Carbon prices with an upward sloping curve should have the opposite effect.
Yeah.
And that's what I understood you to be saying.
Yeah. So now it's just here first. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. Just concerning, comment on social capital, certainly it was remarkable your explanation. But at the end, social capital is an accumulated know-how through the generations. It's extremely important. I will give a very concrete example. Germany, just after the Second World War, we see that in 1956, Germany becomes number one economy in Europe. In such a short time. Why? Because still, with millions of people who died, scientists, engineers, etc., still there was human capital, social capital, which is different than human resources. So, and your function, I will give you just completely opposite example concerning the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire operational structure was that there was some 50 different population in the empire, and this population were running really the operational structure they were the social capital of the empire. But when they left, when the republic was founded, they left. For example, the Hebrew were running in statistical distribution, were running the finance. The Greeks were running the domestic trade. The Levantians were running the international trade. The engineering was run dominantly by the Hungarian origin, etc. So once they left, still today in 2030, most of the problems, when you analyze, again, in Gadamer sense, you go to the source, you will find the lack of social capital which comes from this radical change from the empire operational structure to the one. So in that sense, I just wanted to make. And with your permission, Mr. Chairman, just our dear friend Peter, globalization, I don't know if I used correctly. We mustn't forget that globalization created for the last 3 decades, accumulative riches at the world level, we reached $79 trillion now. But it did create, at the end, in terms of Gini coefficients and Lorentz curves, and worsening of income distribution. So it's not an appearance, it's a reality. So I just wanted to make that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, all right. Yeah, yes, all right.
Oh, thank you. I want to point out that I was speaking as an engineer, actually, that in the drawings here of networks and the metaphors of networks, what is assumed seems to be a solid line, or even a dotted line. What might be useful is the notion of coupling. What is the nature of the coupling between actors?
Yeah, that's right. Especially the links and how the middle. I'm sorry it goes over, but go there. Yeah,
I just want to ask if we should distinguish between information and knowledge, and between knowledge and wisdom. We are bombarded by information, which steals our time. Turning information into knowledge takes time. Even information about other people's knowledge requires that we assimilate that, and it takes time to do that. Turn knowledge into wisdom takes even more time.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, very important. So, Gary.
Thank you. Just two very short comments and a question for Peter. Walter, I enjoyed your presentation very much. Just two short ones. You use the term decentralized in a way that that word has other connotations in organization, where there is still a central organization, but we decentralize certain aspects. Harlan Cleveland, a former president of the Academy, coined the term uncentralized organization, which I think may be a useful way to distinguish this. Second point, it was very interesting what you talked about, the virtual identities. Another way to think of it is what we call our identity now is really also an identity defined by our social network. And what the virtual worlds make possible is to liberate us from the limitations of this type of identity and widens the aspect so it has the potential, positive or negative, of giving us the individual a greater freedom to develop than the external context, which is not maybe more real world, but it's the precious. Question for Peter, and a central issue. If I've understood you correctly about the power law, and I maybe missed it, there is an inbuilt tendency of networks to move towards greater and greater inequality. If I'm wrong, you can clarify for me. And we do see that, I think we do see that properly. But if we define the optimal goal of a network, like any organization, as the overall optimal well-being of the whole. For example, if language is a networking tool, and we believe that the optimal goal is that everybody has access to the tools of language and we can communicate with everybody, or if money is a networking tool and we define as optimal that everybody should have enough money to achieve well-being. Like any organization, a network must be capable. There are some networks that are more power concentrated and some that aren't, that are less. What does network science tell us about the inbuilt capacity to...
Okay, that was a question to Peter.
That's Peter.
Networks don't naturally trend towards greater inequality. If you like, the power law is a characteristic of the network, and it's a relatively stable characteristic as long as, if you like, the network parameters and so the key things are the degree of connectivity, the intensity of linkage. If you increase the intensity of linkage, you increase the power law distribution, so you tend to increase the inequalities. And what's happened with both globalization and particularly with the internet is we've increased the intensity of linkage. And this has some very positive effects. It allows wealth to permeate more rapidly. It allows virtually anybody in the world, through a combination of circumstances, to become extremely rich, extremely fast. but it has created this extreme wealth concentrated in a number of individuals and organizations in the world. Now, the question whether is it a perceived problem or is it a real problem? It's a real problem. In that the inequality distribution is more extreme than it was.
But it's an unregulated network. My question is, are there principles by which this inbuilt tendency could be compensated? That's really okay. Yes, great.
Two questions. As far as telephones, we have phone books, and we know immediately for the entire world how to reach people. Internet has been a closed game, and I don't believe we have any way of communicating with the entire world. It's kept as a secret. Is it purposefully isolated? So these are questions I'd like to ask the speakers. The other question is that every time you start some major research project, you have to start from the beginning to search for literature. And this is a tremendous loss of time. I think the time is right to have bank of ideas where we build with the background information existing in those banks, and then from there on we build the next step. Otherwise, we will be just spending all the time trying to put the links together. So I'd like to know your viewpoints for both, Peter and
I take one question more, and then the panel will answer. And then, there was,
Thank you very much. I'll make it very short. In terms of the discussion on net, there was some of the authors that presenters had alluded to the term institution. And I'm just looking at the literature on the new institutional economics. And when I say institutions, I'm not talking about organizations, I'm talking about rules and norms, both informal and formal. And so, in the previous intervention in terms of negative, positive social capital, when one puts it within the institutional framework and talking from a transaction cost, and transaction cost can either be in the monetary terms, but in the case of the mafia, the transaction cost could be just bodies found in the river, depending on whichever. But it provides a framework to sort of see how do you evaluate these networks, because as you're mentioning, I was a little bit concerned with this correlation within connectedness and inequality. Two things come up. One is classic question: inequality of what? And I think it was primarily moving towards income, but there is a broader perspective, and I think we've moved beyond that. But just from a project that we did in Nairobi, where we found that by having an information network that was not there before among different groups of people in terms of just information about land prices, in terms of land use changes, immediately the inequality was starting to be narrowed between those who have. It's basically asymmetric information, which basically creates this inequality.
Thank you. Now I turn to the panel, to the speakers, just to answer the questions or just to give them some kind of remarks. So,
thank you for comments. I will start with I skipped because of the time constraints. I had, in fact, Stu Roosevelt was writing. I cited him about negative social capital. This is very important. And the way how to avoid is in institutional design. I understand also institutions as rules and norms, and social capital is more than rules and norms because it is the trust. So the institutions themselves do not produce. I mean, so social capital, I would say, institution plus trust. It would be, that type of. Anyway, and then we can avoid convert network into building negative capital by transparency, by inclusivity. If they are getting exclusive, so they're closed, so they started producing negative capital. Resilience is very important. This is another, somehow it's connected with important comments, there is a certain lifespan of social capital, and sometimes it's very resilient, or change, it is positive and negative, I grew up in under communist rules, for us to retain the values, the norms our parents grew up was very important, and that still I see there was a strong resistance. I grew up in Poland, and then to keep those traditional values and networks of family friends who committed to this. But at the same time, we need to look, that the system change, imposed by the foreign, produce a lot of negative capital, mistrust, destroyed a lot. The damages to social capital by the communists were underestimated. They were huge. It's still not fully recovered. So what I wanted to say that as each form of capital, social capital requires continuing investment. And this is something important. If I look, at the most performing clusters, industrial clusters, are those which have the regular meeting. I had representative from the optical cluster from Arizona. I say over 20 years we miss only 2 monthly meetings. They have regular monthly meeting, exchanging information, having simple agenda, but meeting face to face. And the same I learned few months ago in Basque Country, which really based the strategy and recovered from the crisis in the 80s, based on the cluster policies, So they are, meeting regularly. Okay, so this is something what we need to keep in mind. If we're talking about any form of capital, we need to think about investing, because it's normal process of where it is. Okay, thank you, Peter.
I hope I didn't sound pessimistic or negative about the globalization and the internet impact on the world. You're absolutely right. It's created enormous new wealth, brought enormous numbers of people into a much more prosperous lifestyle. So the net effect is extremely positive. This is why the analysis that I've done suggests that we have to pursue this track. We have to make networks more pervasive and more performant. So we have to engage more people. It will happen. This is not pious hope. The next generation of the mobile telephony systems, the 4th generation, will be rolled out probably to 5 billion people in the world, and it will integrate mobile telephony and internet access. So, we are going to double the number of people with internet access within a few years. So, we're still on a very, very dynamic track here. Now, all I'm saying is that this does have some consequences that we have to be careful about. It will tend to increase the disparities in wealth. It will tend to concentrate wealth into too few hands, which can be damaging. We must strengthen anti-monopoly rules, because people, if they get the opportunity, they will get the monopoly rate from a dominant position in the market. We must address the issue of too big to fail banks, because banks have gone down this route. And it is extremely dangerous that we have an over-concentration of power and influence in a few banks. So, yes, there are some issues, and the dangers are at the top of the wealth spectrum. at the bottom of the wealth spectrum, the worst poverty is going to be not being connected. So let's get the last 2 billion connected as well. Now, there are instabilities that come with this as well. The network has brought with it a new type of instability. And it appeared very fast. The internet boom and bust of the year 2000 was a classic network growth instability. You get initially a very fast growth, a Metcalfe's law growth of the telephone and the internet network. It's an end growth, it's not exponential growth, it's faster than exponential growth. And it runs out of control. And because it's a self-limiting hyperbolic growth, you have this turning point. I mean, the turning point in that particular growth trajectory in April 2000, and we caused the crash in the internet company Equifax. The recent crisis that we've been through almost certainly is also a network-driven growth, an addiction to debt-financed growth. Now, it's a much more complex circumstance than that we had in 2000, but the characteristics of it are exactly the same. So we must learn how to deal with these new instabilities as we become more and more a network society. The reason we don't have telephone directories on the internet is people didn't want it. You are perfectly free to put your mobile telephony number on the internet directories, but not many people do. And nobody has ever wanted an internet email address directory. The Facebook serves a purpose, if you like. So it's entirely a question of what people want to put in something.
Okay. Terry, we wanted to answer one of your remarks. Terry, identity has always been based on mutual recognition. That never changes. I pointed it out yesterday with calculator. Gerald, the transformation of information into knowledge and of knowledge into wisdom is a question of reiteration. So if you know that you know, or if you are informed about the information, then you call it knowledge. And if you know that you know, then you start to become wise, because then you know that you don't know. That's just so it's not 3 different type of things, but they are connected by reiteration. And then I think Ian, I have to do a lot with Vattenfall Company, and Vattenfall Company immediately, after paying for carbon, passes it on to the customer. So at the end of the day, that's the price of energy. So it's, analytically speaking, 2 different things. But if you look at reality, then the energy producing companies or energy transforming companies pass it on to the customer. So it's a question of the energy price at the end. And your question, you said already, if you look at the fastest growing technologies in the developing world, especially in Africa, guess what? Cell phones. Cell phones is by far the fastest growing technology market, and they leapfrog all the other developmental stages we in Europe have had in between. So they go immediately to the cell phone society, and the cell phone society is internet access by definition. Okay.
Thank you. And
well, definitely, probably 2 minutes. Go back to basics. So there are many examples that have been mentioned, but what is underlying and what is new? There is a science that is called the science of network. There is a science of complexity, and what is underlying is up to date is a very strong mathematical basis that allows to discover correlations in networks that everybody thinks to understand. But the organism of bacteria with the same correlation as in the internet, the physical internet. So that similarity, that is fabulous. So, but the knowledge is increasing. And so, one picture here that comes from Wikipedia. So everybody can have it. And I spoke with a large number of colleagues, and nobody knew it. That's very surprising. Now, first, the person it comes out of a book by Castellani, and speaks about the sociology and complexity, something like that. It's very recent, a couple of years ago. So that comes out of there. But the message is that sociology is moving fast to another type of exploration, and to go away from narratives which we have heard this morning, which have nothing to do with the science of network, even not with interpretation. It is the correlation, the quantitative correlations that count. You pronounce the word of Orwell, okay, that's one of them. No, everybody knows how it is, but it has now been quantified at the level of bacteria and at the microscopic level of the internet. So this is important. I have knowledge of a project within the United Nations, but I don't know where it is, to analyze with a network science how it is structured. Yeah. So we realize where we are. So Peter, you spoke about the banking crisis. Okay, probably if this technology is designed would have been applied before, maybe we could have avoided. So I think, and so the session has been very interesting. It is almost a program for now. So I got the floor to say what has happened today. What is the plan? There has been an e-workshop, I think it's February or something like that. Anyway, an e-workshop on networking, of which that slide is covered. Now, it is a series of 3 workshops on a network, the next one on complexity, and the third one on self-organization, autopoiesis. So the next workshop is scheduled, let's say, end of April, beginning of May, and it is organized with the WebEx and limited 35 participants. So, okay, last time we were somewhat less than 20. Yeah, okay. So there again, my preference would be to talk about the basics. So there is the novelty, there it is new, and I would say that, and so I joined it, although I'm not a sociologist, but that is coming, and let's criticize that. Let's have a look at it. If this is coming, then we speak about another type of sociology that we are speaking about now. So this is fundamental. That is going on, to my opinion. So I've said what the planning is. The third workshop on autopoiesis comes, as far as I personally know, from the medical, biological, biochemistry output, which has been fantastic, of enormous consequences. And so I'm referring to the Nobel Prize to Mark Manfred Eigen, to Peterfi, to others, to the Duke, all these have taught, and where it's going to. What does mean autopoiesis? What does mean self-organization? As well as in sociology, but in our world. It is a topic, I would say. It's one of the most important topics we could address within the World Academy, when we speak about what's the thinking, the content of the thinking of the next 50 or 100 years. So, I close immediately for those who might be interested. So, the networking, the new side of networking, it is not an isolated event. In this picture here, so have a look on the internet, on Wikipedia. It's from the 1970s up to today. 40, 50 years all that new knowledge has emerged. And the relations, it's a personal vision from Castellani, there is a link, but how they are linked with each other. So networking is not an isolated new thing. It is it's over here, but it is so poorly represented. Sorry for that. So the networking is there, the complexity is over here, the system dynamics of the report of the Club of Rome is over there. There are names mentioned and readable so far. There is the system theory of Pestalozzi. So all that new way of the last 50 years, this is fabulous. And I would speak, and I thought that the academy has an open eye for the science of it, not for the narratives. Yeah, that is okay. I'm not against narratives, but this is not progress. Yeah, the progress lies in the science of it. Yeah, what came out of the poisons and the philosophical consequences. It's enormous. Yeah. So anyway, so you know what's going on, and hope that you join the workshop. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Once again, and now I would like to thank all the speakers for the very interesting talks and all this discussion. And